This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, most valuable evidence other than DNA, who's in charge of suspect interviews, and vehicle pursuits. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Welcome to episode number 12 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. Each week I mention that listeners help me with covering the cost of this podcast by supporting me for as little as $2 a month through Patreon. In addition to my first supporters, Joan Raymond and Guy Alton, I also have to thank authors Natasha Badgema, Natalie Borelli, Joe Trent, Siobhan Pope, Leah Cutter, and Kim Hunt Harris for their support of this podcast. Learn how to set up your own Patreon page by visiting writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. Screenwriter M. Miller Davis, who you can find at mmillerdavis.com, sent in some great questions last week, and I wanted to finish up answering those. Miller's first question this week is, aside from DNA, what is the most valuable evidence at a crime scene? That really depends on the crime itself. Last week, we talked about the difference between direct and circumstantial or indirect evidence. And I think there's something very powerful about direct evidence, meaning like a victim or survivor or witness giving a firsthand account of a crime. If you were sitting on a jury and a survivor of violent crime gave a firsthand account of the brutal crime and unequivocally, while under oath, meaning it's the crime of perjury to lie while on the stand, points at the defendant that's seated at the defense table and says, that is the person that did this to me. There is no mistaking that. There's no inference that needs to be made, like scientific data, what the value is for forensic data, which is that circumstantial or indirect evidence. So I think there's something really, really powerful about that. I'm sure Miller was referring to more tangible or scientific evidence in the question. So I would also put video right up there at the top of most valuable evidence. Videos everywhere these days. Ring doorbells, officers' body-worn cameras, Facebook Live, Instagram TV, YouTube, surveillance video cameras in stores, inside ATMs, outside gas stations. It's literally everywhere. If the quality of the footage is sufficient to help piece together the puzzle of what happened, it's really hard to defend against video evidence. Even if the crime itself is not actually caught on video, we as detectives or officers, patrol officers, will do an area canvass looking for witnesses, obviously, and also part of that is looking for cameras that may have footage that could help reveal what happened. Even if it's in a neighborhood, more and more we're seeing those Ring doorbells, we're seeing those digital surveillance cameras that record to a DVR. So we're looking for those as we're going around looking for people to talk to that may have something to say about what happened. Even if the crime itself is not caught on video, footage of a suspect or a suspect vehicle coming into or fleeing the area of a crime scene can be incredibly important as well. Since most of the video is saved digitally these days, there's often a date and timestamp which helps the investigation firm up that timeline of the crime, of what led up to and what happened after. Other top contenders for most valuable evidence can also relate to firearms. Ballistics can be incredibly important. That's where we can match the marks and striations on a bullet to the gun barrel that it was fired from. We can also test for GSR, which is the abbreviation for gunshot residue, if we have a suspect detained. This can be very important in identifying which specific person pulled the trigger. If the murder was a drive-by shooting and patrol officers stop a suspect vehicle that was fleeing the scene, but let's say there are 4 people in the car, identifying the shooter can be vitally important. In that scenario, all 4 of the vehicle's occupants would be detained and their hands would be swabbed with a sterile, sticky applicator that, or actually, what's the opposite of applicator? De-applicator. Essentially, it's a collection tool that is sterile but has a sticky end, and then it goes into a vial. The officer would dab the webbing of the hands and all along the fingers of each person to try to detect whether they had gunshot residue on their hands. These vials would then be sealed, booked as evidence, and ultimately tested at a crime lab. After they collect that evidence sampling that's going to go to the lab, they may also do a presumptive test where another sample is taken, and then that result can show up in the field. You can do a little reagent, kind of little chemistry kit that will show you whether or not gunshot residue is present. It's not as scientific or definitive when it comes to giving an official lab result to be used in court, but if you test 3 or 4 people out at a crime scene and one of them has a chemical reaction for gunshot residue presence, that's a pretty good indicator that you are detaining the correct person. So it can definitely help gain insight into what the evidentiary lab results will likely show upon the testing and help you know whether or not you've detained the right people in the field. Now, if they don't have the GSR kits in the field, the police will need to transport the detainees to the station. And in that case, all 4 of those suspects would have paper bags either tied or taped around their hands. They're most likely wearing handcuffs, so their hands aren't really going anywhere, but they're going to have paper bags, evidence bags, taped or tied around their hands until a GSR test can be conducted. I found a pretty in-depth video about gunshot residue evidence collection on YouTube, and I'll include it in the show notes at writersdetective.com/12. So if you'd like to see what a GSR kit looks like and see how the exams are conducted, definitely check out the show notes and click the link, and you will get a pretty good understanding of what the GSR kit does and what it looks like. And again, this is indirect or circumstantial evidence that requires an inference to be made about what the lab results or even those presumptive results actually mean. A suspect testing positive for GSR doesn't necessarily mean he's the shooter. It just means either he shot a gun recently or handled a gun that was recently fired or was potentially in the immediate vicinity, like inside the car when the gun was fired. So comparing lab results of the GSR testing to the levels of GSR on other occupants in the car may also be required. So there may be GSR on the person that was sitting next to the shooter. But if you compare the levels of the different components or compounds that are collected as part of that gunshot residue, you may get a better picture of what actually happened, and it'll help point investigators in the right direction. So I hope these explanations have planted some sort of story idea in your head. Miller's next question is, who's in charge of suspect interviews? You catch 'em, you clean 'em. The detective handling the case is the one doing the interviews. Interview and interrogation is the bread and butter of detective work. This is not a call in the specialist kind of scenario. We talk to victims, witnesses, and suspects all day long while on patrol and as a detective. So being great at interview and interrogation is key to doing your job. Second only to writing, whether that's reports or warrants, interview and interrogation, or I&I, is the most common thing a detective does. So it's up to the detective to come up with a plan on how the interview and or interrogation should go. One key thing to know is the number one rule in the Detective Bureau, and this applies to bosses as well as partners, is you never, ever interrupt an interview or an interrogation, unless that interruption is planned as part of the interview strategy. If someone needs to inform the detective in the box of a new development in the case, they can wait. If it really, really can't wait, you send a text to their phone, which will very likely be on vibrate or even silent. You never ever just knock on the door and walk in on an interview that's in progress. Imagine getting your suspect right to the point where they're crying. They're remorseful. You're sharing a moment. The suspect is on the very tippy edge of whispering a confession. I did. Someone knocks on the door, interrupting that moment. That was all it took to ruin it. That chance is gone. You can bet that I have personally been on, let's say, the very, very verge of insubordination when scolding a new detective sergeant for doing that very thing. If you want to make your protagonist peeved to the point of steam coming out of their ears and ready to punch someone, have someone crash an important interview for a very unimportant reason. I just wanted to see if you wanted to go to lunch. Yeah. Don't knock on the door. Thanks again for the questions, Miller. And again, check out Miller's work at mmillerdavis.com. Don't you love it when Google searches actually work? Ryan Kinmill discovered our writers detective community last week through a Google search, and I am so glad he found us. You can find Ryan on Twitter at RKINMIL. Ryan wants to know anything and everything regarding car high-speed chases, both in the city and on highways, training for the drivers, if there's any difference from them and normal officers, any resources where I could get better insight into their work, and what do people usually get wrong, maybe echoed in those questions above. Well, Ryan, each agency has their own pursuit policy. It covers whether they even do pursuits, and some agencies refuse to. And if they do enter into a pursuit, under what circumstances? How should they be conducted, such as how many police cars should be involved in the pursuit? Because we have a tendency to have everybody go. So a lot of times they will limit the number of cars allowed in a pursuit. What is or isn't permissible? Can you use the pit technique? Can you ram them? Can you set up roadblocks? And here's a little hint for you writers. Roadblocks are generally considered lethal force, so be careful when writing that into your story or script. And the most important part of any pursuit policy, when should those pursuits be terminated? When we think of car chases in stories or on the screen, it's all about the action, keeping the viewer interested. And I say viewer because reading a car chase can be very boring if it goes on too long in a book. In fact, if you read the script for one of the most memorable car chases in film history, I'm talking about The French Connection, the car chase scenes are largely camera direction. Check this out. This is taken directly from the script. Exterior, Doyle's car, day. Side, close view of Doyle, driving while he's looking up. He skids through a red light, narrowly missing a pedestrian and an oncoming group of cars. Long, low view of the train from Doyle's position. Interior, subway train, day. Close shot of cord dangling above a sign that says, pull for emergency stop only. It just dangles, wobbles, forgotten in the panic. Exterior, Doyle's car, day. Close side shot of Doyle driving, skidding on streetcar tracks, panning upward to show the car pulling ahead of the train. I would imagine most of you have seen The French Connection. Those 3 paragraphs, one of which was the subway, don't do any justice to one of the most memorable car chases in cinematic history. I would put Bullitt's car chase right up there with it. But as you can see, those were mainly camera directions. So I want to caution novelists listening to this that part of your story that features a car chase should move just as quickly as the car chase itself. Now, this is me as a reader, not as a writer. But as a reader, I find that when the action in a story picks up, so does my speed of reading. I feel my eyes flitting from line to line. So if I'm reading a long prose version of The French Connection car chase, the writing should be fast and the details blurred, just like Popeye Doyle's perception of what's happening. Now, it didn't say it in the script just now, but I remember the movie. And when Popeye's car narrowly misses a woman with the bassinet, don't give me a sentence on the design of the baby carriage. Popeye barely had time to register woman, baby, swerve. That's the way we're reading it along with you. I love when the writing style matches the scene. But when it doesn't work, I start to lose interest. Anyway, sorry for the rant. We'll get back to pursuits. When you're in a pursuit, you are constantly balancing the need to capture this fleeing suspect against the risks you and the bad guy are putting the public into. So it's entirely likely and possible, that either the protagonist or their supervisor will terminate the pursuit before it gets too out of hand or risky. Clearly, film directors like William Friedkin or Michael Bay don't let pursuit policy get in the way of exciting storylines, and you shouldn't either. So take this answer with a grain of salt. This podcast is all about keeping your stories real, but it's also about knowing where you can fudge things for the sake of telling great stories. So just keep what I'm about to say in mind when it comes to creating those progressive complications in your stories. If you get to a point in your story where you think the protagonist would realistically call off the pursuit, perhaps you haven't raised the stakes of your story high enough. All police officers, deputy sheriffs, state troopers that drive a police car in the course of their duties, which would be about 90+% of them, get what's called, or what we call, EVOC training. Now, EVOC stands for Emergency Vehicle Operations Course. If you search EVOC training on YouTube, you will see that it covers everything from parallel parking a police car and collision avoidance to high-speed lane changes, threshold braking and cornering, pursuit driving, obviously, and in many cases, the pit maneuver, which is the pursuit intervention technique of pressing the front corner of your police car up against the rear corner of the bad guy's car to cause the bad guy to spin out. I would also recommend looking up the term police pursuit policy and the word Lexipol, Lexipol, to find some examples of what cops can and can't do in a pursuit. Now, Lexipol is a company that many police departments across the country use to draft, maintain, and update their departmental policies. Since police agencies have very similar policies across the country and all are affected by case law changes, Lexipol takes the heavy lifting out of having to update your department's policy every time a law is updated or a new ruling is published. So you don't really need to know about the company Lexipol so much as the company name in a Google search will help you get some great results that are actual department policies. So doing a Google search of, quote, police pursuit policy Lexipol, end quote, will reveal several agencies' policies on pursuits. So taking a quick look will show that policies cover things like, does the officer know the identity of the person being pursued? And if so, would it be safer to terminate the pursuit and attempt to capture the suspect later? Do we really need to be chasing the kid that's always stealing cars or has a warrant if we know we can arrest him at home later? Is the officer familiar with the area the pursuit's happening in? There are definitely inherent dangers in pursuing someone through unfamiliar territory. Things like knowing there's a school zone or construction zone ahead, or that there's a traffic jam at this intersection every afternoon, can mean avoiding a fatal accident if the pursuit goes on too long into an unfamiliar area. What are the performance capabilities of the police car versus the suspect's vehicle? I don't care how great a driver you are, a Ford Crown Victoria is not going to keep up with a Suzuki Hayabusa motorcycle. If your protagonist is in an unmarked detective car, is it equipped with the lights and siren required by the vehicle code? If so, is there a department policy against going into pursuit in an unmarked car? Some agencies have policies like that, others don't. Do you already have an arrestee in the back of your car? Or how about a ride-along? There's probably a policy against having civilians tag along for a pursuit, especially if they've been detained in the back of the police car and have no choice in whether they're going along for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And of course, my personal favorite, is air support available? If your story takes place in Los Angeles, there's a very high probability that you'll have a helicopter overhead in only a few short minutes, if not seconds. Elsewhere in the country, the response can be maybe an hour or more, or even non-existent. Having an airship overhead means the helicopter can call the pursuit, which means providing updates as the location and circumstances of the pursuit change, or determine when it's an appropriate time to end the pursuit. Once a helicopter is overhead, it's common to have pursuing officers fall back and trail, allowing the airship to simply surveil the bad guy to a stopping point and then call in those uniformed officers to set up a perimeter and ultimately capture the guy away from the car he was being pursued in. The bottom line about pursuits is that, despite being exciting, they are incredibly dangerous. Remember the what if game from episode 10? What if your protagonist's car chase results in your bad guy T-boning a soccer mom van, killing a family of 4? How is your protagonist going to justify the car chase, especially if they know the identity of the bad guy? Doesn't mean we can't chase bad guys. We just need to know the stakes of what we're doing and be able to articulate why the risk was worth a dangerous car chase in the first place. Just some realistic food for thought. Thanks for the question, Ryan. Again, you can find Ryan Kinmil on Twitter at RKINMIL. I keep talking about ConvertKit because I love using their service. If you want to increase your open rate so more people read your emails and buy your books, or if you want to learn more advanced features like how to survey your email list using link triggers and tags that probably sound a little scary, but they're actually super easy and logical to use. Or if you want to learn how to create custom automated sequences to get more book sales in less time, then mark your calendars for October 24th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. Then go to writersdetectivebureau.com/webinar to register for ConvertKit's free webinar. You will learn useful tactics for using your email list to sell books, regardless of whether you sign up for ConvertKit service. I hope you'll check it out. Again, it's October 24th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, which is 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. if you're in London, England, 8 p.m. in Johannesburg, South Africa, and yikes, 5 a.m. on October 25th if you're in Melbourne, Australia. The link again is writersdetectivebureau.com/webinar to register. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe. If you belong to a writers group, in person or online, I would love it if you'd share this podcast. This podcast is created for you. So don't be shy and submit your crime fiction questions, or just say hello at writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Write well.